I'm going to talk about managing metabolic heat, and it's a I'm going to kind of combine some things that we've found, not just in our incubators. Obviously, that's most likely the real important thing here is how we run our incubators and manage this heat, but a little bit too about what effects this can have on performance of our birds. And you see in the title here, our broiler performance, or really it's birds in general, whether they be turkeys, ducks, whatever. The principles kind of all apply here as far as what the effects of our incubation time have on our final product, whatever it may be. Looking at the fertilization process, the very beginning of embryo development, obviously fertilization must occur. It starts with insemination, whether it be artificial or natural insemination. And then there's a series of events that occur within that, that hen. She stores sperms. It's got to be transported to the site of fertilization. And then you've got a recognition of binding sites and acrosome reactions and all this stuff that I won't really talk about. But all of that has to, let me get my pointer on here. All of that has to occur to get our final fertilization. And so we'll talk a little bit about where that is occurring as well. Fertilization occurs in that infundibular region, and really it's within 5 minutes of ovulation. So a hen ovulates an egg, or she lays an egg, and 20 minutes later, she will ovulate the egg that she will lay the next day. And within minutes, and I have here less than 5 minutes, some literature will say longer than that, but I've done a lot of research on this for different reasons. And within minutes, fertilization occurs in that infundibular region here. And once albumin starts getting put on that egg, then fertilization cannot occur. That's an inhibitor there. So it has to occur at that point, and then it stops. Well, of course, from that point, the egg traverses down the oviduct. It takes 24 to 26 hours to complete formation of that egg at a body temperature in the hen of, around 104 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit or 40, 41 Celsius. And obviously during that time, we have the temperature sufficient to have embryo grow. So we have an embryo or an egg that's laid with 40 to 60,000 cells, possibly more, depending on other conditions. Particularly by the time the egg gets to the hatchery, it may be more than that if you have some pre-incubation. But a laid egg right out of a hen is going to have 40 to 60,000 cells, and that's really why we can see in two eggs here that are unincubated. And these two eggs, we have an infertile egg. We see a very compact dermal disc region, and that fertile egg, we'll see a little donut. That's because we've already have cellular activity. We already have that embryo starting to grow. And so I always like to just point that out as we're talking about any of these things when it deals with embryo and embryo growth and development. So when we look at the sperm cell, or the sperm itself, it's stored in these crypts, right in this region here of the oviduct. So we have sperm stored, and it's a biological necessity. For instance, because that albumin has such an inhibiting factor on fertilization, that hen has to have sperm there ready at that site of fertilization. Otherwise, she would have to be mated every single day between the time the hen lays an egg and the next one ovulates. So in that 20-minute period. So it's a necessity in the entire avian world, and in few mammals have the ability to store sperm as well. But because of that, it's one of the factors we look at as far as what can affect our embryo livability. Yes, they can store sperm for ability to be fertilized, but they can't store it indefinitely, and it starts to degrade after a point of time as well. We can see that here on this chart. If you've seen my presentations before dealing with anything with embryo diagnosis or heterozygote, and I talk about this a lot, but I think it's important to understand because we still deal with this. In this study, what we did is we inseminated hens with sperm, 100 to 200 million sperm, which is what would happen in a natural mating situation. So artificially, we followed what would normally occur. And we can look at fertility out here to about 8 days. We kept in the upper 90s down, still just above 90, and then it starts to drop pretty dramatically, fertility. And these are days after that single mating. So these were caged, so we know there was no more mating activity. What we can also see here is as that fertility begins to drop, this red line is the percentage of those fertile eggs that died early embryo death. So we get out here, 10 to 12 days, we start seeing an increase of the fertile eggs dying early embryo mortality, the first 3 or 4 days. And that continues to increase to where, yes, 2.5 weeks between matings, there can be some fertile eggs, but we had, 50 to 60% or more of those eggs that were fertile, we had embryo mortality. The reason why I bring this up, we deal with this all the time, is people are looking at embryo mortality trends, and they start seeing embryo mortality increase, particularly in older flocks, with that decrease in fertility, which is often associated with infrequent mating. So we see that kind of ties back to what I was saying about these stored sperm, that the sperm goes in these storage tubules and they line up at the bottom of the tubule. Well, the last sperm in is the first sperm back out to travel up this oviduct. So if all of a sudden that hen's not mated for a while, the hen will keep taking sperm off the top. So eventually when she gets down utilizing the last sperm there, it could be 2 to 3 weeks old, and she can maintain, or that sperm can maintain the ability to fertilize, but it's compromised. It often gives us a weak embryo that we see death and early embryo mortality. We did a little study, say, okay, what effect might this have beyond incubation? And so we inseminated some hens and we set eggs that were, 0 to 5 days after that single mating, 6 to 10 days, 11 to 15 days, and looked at our hatch. Yes, our hatch is low here because in this instance, we used a lower sperm dose, so we can see some differences more quickly. And we can see here, when we get out to beyond 10 days, our hatch greatly was reduced, which we expect. Hatch of fertile was reduced because of the embryo mortality. But what was interesting is we took the broilers in and did a short grow out on them. And we can see the body weight was less on the broilers from the sperm that had been stored long, 7-day livability, 14-day livability, or weight gain was lower on both 7 and 14 in those that had stored sperm in the hen in vitro longer or in vivo. And we had a higher mortality of those as well. So kind of goes back and say, okay, so when that sperm has ability to fertilize, we get a higher embryo mortality. We also get poorer performance of our birds out in the field. And then we just looked at overall egg storage length. And again, this is just tying back to the effects that we see in incubation that also can affect the performance of birds out in the field. When we just stored eggs 0 to 5 days, 6 to 10, 11 to 15 days, of course, we expect a poor hatch on the eggs stored after or longer than 10 days. Again, the bird, this was in broilers. We had a lower body weight at hatch, a lower 7-day weight, a lower 14-day weight, and a higher 14-day mortality when the eggs were stored longer. So again, re-emphasizing that fact that things that happen in incubation and embryo development, it's not just an effect on our hatchery and our hatchability, it affects our bird performance. And I've seen this many times. I think most of you can probably collaborate this, is look at or corroborate this. You can look at some of your data, and typically your best hatching flocks will have the best chance of being your best performing birds. If you have problems with hatchability, particularly from certain flocks, those birds typically will have a little bit more difficult time out in the field. So stress in an embryo does not just affect our embryo livability, it affects long-term of the bird. And we'll get to a little bit more of that when we're talking about heat. And so in our storage, and just real quick, we always look at our storage parameters, because I've just mentioned our long-term storage, reducing stress in that developing embryo, and having the eggs exposed to temperatures such as what we see here in the hen's body, and then the hen house, and on-farm egg room, egg truck, and egg room. We want those temperatures to slowly be decreasing, one direction change. And then once we start warming them up, moving them into the incubator. This for short-term storage, not talking about spideys or long-term storage. This gives us the best results in our chicks, our embryos, our hatchability, because we have less stress on that embryos from temperatures increasing and decreasing. And again, reducing stress in our chicks, reducing stress in our embryos, managing our eggs to keep a constant and reduce stressful or challenging situations. So kind of summarizing this, by ovulation, there's a 1-day development of that embryo, and we must take care to protect that embryo. Storage length, both eggs and sperm cells will have been shown to influence hatchability, but also they've been shown to affect negatively 2-week livability and performance of broilers, and birds. I mean, this is the work we did was on broilers, but it would be bird performance, because I look at it and say, you stress some embryos to the point some died. Well, the others that did not die were also stressed, and we know that stress has a negative effect on performance. So we see this linger throughout performance. So when we're talking about an embryo, and I always like to kind of use the analogy, it's like building a house. We have to go in the proper order. I used to work construction years ago, hung sheetrock, and so everything had to be done before we got there. You know, the foundation had to be laid, the walls had to be up, the electrical, the plumbing, all these things had to be, the ventilation for the most part had to be in place before we covered up those walls. And we cannot do any of it in reverse. And the same with our embryos, there's a systematic order in how that embryo grows. And if we miss a period of time or add stress at a period of time, we will affect long-term that embryo growth, because we can't really go back and fix things. So we look at embryo growth, and there's a couple different phases. The phase of differentiation really goes out to about 12 days. Most of that is really occurring at the earlier stages, 4, 5, 6, 7 days. But we call this a differentiation stage because the embryo is not growing rapidly. It's still building all the components, and it has to be done in the right order. So for instance, if in our incubation time period at 5 or 6 days, we have a temperature spike or a cool spot when certain parts of the embryo were being built and developed, we can have lingering effects because we can't go back and fix that. So we look at that after this early period when we're growing the parts of the embryo, then we get into this growth phase where we just see a lot of accelerated growth. And interesting, that's when we start seeing a lot of the heat production, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So the basics of incubation. I won't spend a lot of time in this. We all know this. Temperature controls embryo growth rate, essentially faster or slower. You know, there's consequences of either, but temperature really controls that, the rate of growth of the embryo. Humidity really controls our moisture loss. We have to have a certain amount of moisture loss, not too much, not too little, but the humidity controls that. But the ventilation works with the humidity and temperature, because we're trying to get a proper gas exchange. We want that temperature uniformly distributed throughout our incubation cabinet. We want that humidity and the gas exchange coming off the eggs uniformly pulled out of all the eggs, or exchanged between all the eggs uniformly throughout that cabinet. So our ventilation is critically important. They're not only temperature, we want temperature right, but it needs to be uniform throughout the cabinet, and it will not be without proper ventilation. We see situations where we have customers where, you know, they're saying that everything's right and the temperature's right, the machine's trying to work that, but they have poor ventilation. The air's moving too slow, or it's got some gaps in there through the way they set eggs. And so we don't have uniform air movement through that machine. So we will have some hot spots or cold spots, and that can have some very detrimental effects. And then our turning, of course, freedom of embryo movement, but also we have to remember that always helps with uniformity of the environment. Every time those racks are moving, we have an air pattern that's going across them, and when they turn one direction, then the air pattern has to move. So every time they move, we kind of deflect and change the air movement through that cabinet, which helps with our uniformity. So ventilation is, we see this very often in some of the consulting work we do. We see the ventilation is just not best, not adequate, or not optimum. I'll put it that way. Could be within the cabinet, or the hall pressures, or the plenum pressures. You know, all those need to be right to make sure that ventilation's right, so we can get uniform growth. So what happens in Mother Nature? What does she do? How does she manage this? You know, I grew up as a young kid. I had all kinds of chickens. I mean, I had every kind of bird you can think of, and raised them. And for some reason, every bird or pet I had, I felt like it must reproduce. Maybe that's why went to reproductive physiology. I don't know, but so how do they do that? I'd see hens in a rose bush hatch chicks, and in Arizona, and they'd be out in the barn, and it's hot, and they'd hatch chicks. So what do they do? The hen's responsibility is to control the environment, the temperature, humidity, and gas exchange. She has to control that. And she doesn't have all these controllers and all this air movement and ventilation that we do. And she also turns the eggs. So how does she accomplish this, controlling the environment? It's very important that they do that. So a study was done where they looked at the attentiveness percent of time the hen spends on the nest, and we can see in chickens there's a variance there. What is that variance? So if it's a really hot spring, she will sit on the eggs early on. As the embryos grow and start producing more heat, she spends a lot more time off the eggs to let that heat escape. If it's really cold, she's going to sit tighter. She's going to be more attentive to the eggs to maintain that heat. But I've put thermometers under hens and watch them, and they will follow this pattern that we look at when I start talking about our incubation temperatures that we put in our machines, our cabinets, to maintain the proper embryo temperature. They'll sit really tight early on, but I could tell every time a hen got off the nest, because the temperature of that thermometer would drop, and they get off more and more frequently as you move further and further into the incubator, the embryo development period. So a hen's doing this. She knows, and from what I'd read, even in the wild, hens that would have a clutch of eggs, a larger clutch of eggs than normal, all of them fertile, she would get off a lot. If a hen had a clutch of eggs and for one reason or another there was a lot of infertile or early dead embryos in there for whatever conditions, there's not as much embryo heat, she's going to sit tighter. So they're managing that and trying to manage that heat, because they know that excess heat can be detrimental. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to mimic, the mother hen, what Mother Nature does, create a complete environment from beginning to end. She does that, and she can change from one clutch of eggs to another clutch of eggs, depending on the external environments. So looking at embryo development, fertilized egg will then transition from that early embryo and within the incubator to the point it's producing its own embryonic heat. Embryo development, we have metabolism equals growth equals heat. And the natural byproduct of that embryo development is heat and CO2. Consequently, as we move further into our incubation period, we will add less heat. We will often increase ventilation because we're trying to remove that heat. We're trying to move the CO2 that's being produced in those growing, developing embryos. So as we know, heat is the driving force that establishes and maintains and controls that embryo development. We supplement it early, and later on, we really take that away. Now, that was an interesting thing to me as a kid, just trying to figure this out myself. I just thought an incubator's job is to just heat the eggs. When we look at our incubators now, if you really look at some of our incubator, the activity, particularly in our single stage, they had heat in the first 3 to 4 hours, and they had very little heat the rest of the time. From that point on, the machine, the incubator's real job is to take heat away. We manage it in the middle, and then we start taking it. So it's a cooling. It really does more cooling than it does heating. But that proper heat is of absolute importance to get that correct temperature. That proper heat allows for proper and precise rate of embryo development, and it'll produce the quality chicks. Proper heat will produce that quality chick that we want, that platinum chick, or that chick that's going to get out in the field, whether it be broiler or layer, and perform well. So the focus today, as I move into really the embryonic heat, managing that embryonic heat is really the primary responsibility of incubation and resulting bird performance. Of course, we have to manage that heat in particularly in broilers. Spent a lot of time in South Georgia, and I tell you what, managing that heat on some 7-week-old broilers in July is tough, but it's just as important in incubators as it is there. There you have a lot of financial loss because you have a lot into the birds at that time. But if we don't manage that embryo heat at the end of embryo development, like at the end of a broiler grow out, we can have losses. And that's kind of the same thing, is that they're producing more heat at the end of embryo development and at the end of their grow out in the field, particularly for meat birds. So 3 keys to understanding the embryonic heat. The first week, the embryo needs heat. So we add heat that first week. That second week, and we're basically controlling, first and second week overlap, but we're controlling and maintaining that heat. That third week, that embryo is producing heat, and that stage of development where our responsibility is to remove it. So there's 3 phases of incubation. There's an endothermic phase, a neutral phase, and an exothermic phase. And that endothermic phase, we say it's that first week. Like I said, our machines add little heat at that time. We add a little bit, but we're supplying whatever heat's there. The embryos just do not produce enough. So we have to supply that. That middle week, the second week, and particularly out to 10, 11 days, there's not a lot. They're producing some heat. They need some, so we're really not having to do, the machines aren't doing a lot, just kind of balancing and maintaining that. Then we get into that exothermic stage, that third week. Usually starts in essence in a big way at 14 days, but we start seeing that 11, even 12 days, we start seeing that embryo heat increase in those chicks. So 3 phases. So when we incubate our eggs, we have to be concerned with these 3 phases. This is not too different than raising broilers. Early on, we're adding heat to help them. Then they get to a point where managing it, balancing, and then the last week or 2 where they're producing a lot of heat, and we're having to pull that out. So it's really no different than raising like a high producing broiler. So the viable embryo inside the egg, there's a exchange of gases, of water, oxygen, carbon dioxide. We supplement heat. The embryo then gives off heat as it grows, gives off CO2, water. We have water vapor loss, and that's what our machines are trying to balance and manage. And the embryos, obviously, as they get older, will consume more oxygen. 2 reasons we ventilate more at the end: to get rid of that heat, to get rid of the CO2, to make sure there's enough oxygen in relation to the CO2. So how do we control that in our machines? Now, the difference in what we do and what, not we, but our machines will do, and what a hen does, a hen provides that heat primarily through direct contact. She has bare patches on her chest or on her breast. And when she sits on the egg, she'll pull her feathers out, and there'll be direct contact of her skin to the eggs to transfer that heat. So she can kind of gauge the heat of those as well. And that kind of affects her attentiveness when she needs to get up and down. So in our incubators, we have to control that through our air temperature, because the outside, or the air temperature around that embryo, will help control what that embryo is subjected to. And when we go through, when we're trying to remove heat, we have to remember that's really the way we control that, is through our air temperature. So when we look at, typically in one of our machines, if we look at the air temperature to maintain that, and I'll go into this a little bit more detail later, our air temperature continually drops as we progress in the days and cycle, and that embryo is producing more and more heat as it develops in that cycle. And the goal is to maintain a pretty constant shell temperature. Now, really what we're trying to do is, maintain a proper embryo temperature. 100.4 towards the end, 100.3, 100.4, but that shell temperature is the easiest way to measure that. And you realize that at the end, we get a little bit higher shell temperature because that embryo is producing more heat. So there's more heat being removed from that egg, and our shell temperature may be a little bit higher. But that's our easiest way to measure what our embryo is subjected to, is that shell temperature. And we use that for a lot of our work in figuring out what our machines are doing. How can we make our machines work better? So looking at that developing embryo, 12 hours, and we can look at the BTUs produced, very little, almost immeasurable. 10 days, significantly more heat production. 12 days, 14 days, 16 days, 18 days. There's a lot more BTUs produced by that embryo. So we have our endothermic and our exothermic stage where they're producing more heat than they need. So we look at the air temperature, what we try to get them in our machines. A warmer air temperature here when they're not producing as much heat, a cooler air temperature here when they're producing more, because we're trying to pull heat out. And the embryo temperature, we're trying to maintain it about the same, about 100.4 is what it should be. And so our air temperature is what we use to control that. So again, we have 3 different phases: the endothermic, neutral, and exothermic phase. We call them phases 1, 2, and 3. We'll get our desired shell temperature and desired air temperature to maintain that embryo temperature. The function of heat is to supplement, early, maintain, and then regulate. And most of that we know, won't spend a lot of time on that. Wanted to discuss this. Today's embryos are more susceptible and less viable in regard to incubation. And I put a little question mark here because this statement is true. But I spent a lot of time working with breeders, and I'll say even with breeders, a lot of people say, oh, these new breeders, we can't get the performance out of them. Well, yes, you can. You can get the egg production, you can get the fertility. You can, even in the modern broiler. It just takes a little bit more work. Our management has a little bit tighter. We have to really do what we should have been doing all along. We can't cut corners. And I think that's the same with our embryos. We can get the same performance and growth that we always have with our embryos, but they're a little bit less viable in regard to incubation. As a matter of fact, we have to provide an environment that's a little bit more constant than what we used to, partly because that heat they're producing is getting a little bit closer to what could be detrimental, and we'll show that in a little bit. So yeah, they're more susceptible and less viable, but it doesn't mean we can't get the same or better results with our equipment. But the management of the incubation process is more critical and always critical. It's more critical now than it was before, partly because we will see, it's more easy to see some of the problems associated with poor incubation, probably more so now than we used to. So let's look at heat production. This is in broilers, and this was some work done, 1979, so 40 years ago, and we can look at the heat production in that broiler at that time. And we can see out here at 14, 16, 18, 20 days, we can see the milliwatts of heat produced per egg. It kind of plateaus out here in those last few days. This was in 1979. And then we can look in 2009, a little over 10 years ago, that same or a similar pattern, but we see this heat production is significantly more. So we had, we had in 1979, these embryos producing about 150 milliwatts, and in 2009, 33% more heat produced by the same embryos, or by the embryos in that period of time. So has our equipment changed in there? Yes, we have better equipment, but do we still have incubators and equipment out in the field working that were pre-1979? Yes, we have a lot of it. And so we have to be aware of that those machines were never really designed and developed to handle this much heat. And so they really need to be working very efficiently to get rid of the heat production in our modern embryos. What are some other factors that can that can affect the amount of embryonic heat produced? Fertility. Of course, fertility. If we have 98% fertility, that means 9,800 eggs out of 10,000 eggs in machine are producing heat. And if we have 86% embryos, we have, that much many fewer embryos producing heat. So fertility is a big factor. So when we load up a machine with prime eggs, highest fertility we've ever had, that's when our machine is going to be taxed the most as far as can it remove that embryonic heat in that days 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, the last week of incubation. Because those high fertile flocks, we want fertility, obviously, we want more embryos, but that's when we really see the stress. So a lot of times, in particularly multi-stage, we kind of balance our machines so we don't fill a multi-stage machine with all prime flocks or with all old flocks with lower fertility, because they need to share that heat. So fertility can definitely play a role in affecting the embryonic heat produced. The age of the breeder hens. Why does age of the breeder hen affect? Well, we have older flocks, have larger eggs have larger embryos. Those larger embryos will produce more heat. Now, the balance there is that typically our older flocks don't have quite the fertility. So there is a balance. If you have a real high fertile flock, older flock with bigger eggs, we could run into a situation with even a more challenging time of managing that heat, but we typically don't see these real high 98% fertile flocks particularly in our heavy meat birds on these older birds. But that has an effect. Our younger flocks, smaller eggs, smaller embryos, less heat production. So the age of the flock will affect that as well. The breed comparison, there's been some discussion on this, whether this is real or not, and this could be breed, this could be, you know, other factors that contribute into this. But if we look at different broiler breeds, if we look at layers, you know, some of our layer lines, we use different incubation profiles because they produce less heat. Doesn't mean one's better than the other. It's just how we have found in our machines to manage that and keep that shell temperature where we want it to be. So this was some work done using our pilot eggs to where, you know, we had different breeds in a machine, and their pilot was having to add less heat for this particular breed strain. Then this particular breed strain needed a little bit more heat. If we added there's another breed strain I know would be somewhere here, and our layers might even be up here because they're producing less embryo heat, so we don't have to be as cool. You know, if we get 100% fertility in a prime flock with big eggs, you know, we would probably even have to go a little bit lower here because we have to have, there's a differential. If we have an X amount of heat coming out of our eggs and it's something we've never seen before, our outside temperature needs to be even cooler to pull even more heat out. So this was our pilot egg found is what was necessary, what the machine had to do. So do we have different profiles for different strains and types of birds, whether it be layers or broilers or whatever? Yeah, we do. More often than not, people mix eggs in machines and mix strains and ages and stuff. So we don't use that as much, but there is some definite differences in the type of bird that we raise, whether it be broiler, layer, and different strains within each. So when we're looking at our birds managing, there's again, this is that range right here where, you know, zone of hatching potential. And of course, if we get an upper range is 101, very dangerous. And lower than that is dangerous. Right in the middle is the sweet spot where we want to stay. Of course, all these are, you know, going to cause death or permanent damage, you know, too high here. But even within this range, we can see we can get some growth and development if we're, you know, 102, 103, but it's very dangerous and very damaging to the bird. And if it's too cool, very dangerous and very damaging. So these are the temperature we use: start, middle, and then late in development, the prime areas. When we get outside of here, we see death of the embryo. So what happens if we're barely outside of that? We may or may not see death, but we will definitely see an effect on performance of the birds. So looking at chick development, the developing chick is, if the developing chick is heat stressed, there's a poor utilization of the yolk nutrients. And this comes from some work, hatchability.com, a site that has a lot of good information on here. And you can see here that looking at yolk-free body weight and heat production, there's when the embryos were hot, the temperature here, when it's too high, there's more heat production, but there's less utilization of that yolk-free of the yolk. And so we have poor quality chicks. And why do we have poor quality chicks? Is that yolk, that chick, as it utilizes that yolk, we end up getting a more yellow chick because she's utilized the yolk, but the body weight that we measure of that chick is body, it's the chick. If they hatch out with a similar body weight, a 40-gram chick, but this one's got a lot of yolk, it hasn't utilized it. It hasn't gained the benefits of that yolk that's in that it was given by the mother. And then the development from there, we can have mortality, disease, other situations that arise when we have maybe a same size chick, but a chick that hasn't utilized that yolk. Too much heat may give us a similar size chick, but they start shutting down and there's a lot more yolk here. And then we have a poor quality bird. So we have to hit that sweet spot here to where we're getting the biggest chick possible with the largest yolk-free body weight. That gives us the best quality chick. They need to utilize that yolk as much as possible. And when we get them too cool or too hot, then they're gonna underutilize that. So we have to balance. Again, it's a balance. Heat production is one of the byproducts of metabolism. So if we look and we've got too much heat, we're out of balance. Do chicks need heat? Embryos need heat? Absolutely. If there's too much heat, we start getting out of balance as far as our evaporation, heat transfer, heat loss, growth and development, other factors. And so when we keep that temperature balance, the temperature right, so we have a balance of the heat loss and heat production, that's when we get our best embryo. This can teeter both ways. If it's too cool, we're gonna have flip the other way, and then we're not getting a good performance of our bird. So balance is the key here. Too hot, we affect our embryo. What did I say early on? When we affect embryo growth in development, what does it do to the broiler? It's going to affect our bird. It's going to affect our long-term performance. So kind of looking at our machines now and how we do this, and I've got a few more minutes here. Like our Jamesway multi-stage environment tries to give us those two different temperatures by the way we set our eggs. We'll have our older eggs here. We'll transfer the heat from the older eggs to the younger eggs that need heat from those embryos, and the air moves in this manner. So if you look at the temperature within that cabinet, it's going to be warmer on one end and cooler on the other end. Kind of what the embryo needs, but we're doing it in kind of a collective or average way. Our single stage, we don't necessarily have a point where we have older embryos and younger embryos, but the way we move our air in this manner, air comes in through the cooling coils, the fans circulate up and down, and so it comes down through all the eggs and gives us that uniform temperature. And that again is the key, the uniform air movement, uniform temperature. It's not good enough just to have temperature, we have to have it uniform throughout the machines. So then we look at the chick master design. They're doing the same thing. Is that a little bit different design where we've got a big paddle fan in the middle, but the idea is then that paddle fan is going to move air, kind of similar to how we saw in the Jamesway single stage. It's kind of coming up and over and pulling across those eggs. These are all same age embryos, so we don't really have an older and younger point within that machine, but we're moving that air in this pattern here to get us a uniform environment. So now what we have to do then is that whole environment, that temperature in that whole environment is what we have to adjust. So that's what we do with the way we set up our incubation. Is early on in that endothermic stage, this is an example, just an example in a Jamesway machine of a profile. So we will start with a little bit higher temperature set point, and down through day 7, it'll decrease. And then we can look at that neutral stage. We're still decreasing as the embryo starts producing more heat. And you can see the dampers are opening more as well for the reasons, but then also we get out to 18 days and our temperature continues to drop. Exothermic stage, that's when that embryo is producing the most heat. We have to have that cooler air temperature like I showed. The Chick Master uses stage programs, and this is kind of one of their setups here. So you can see their temperature is very similar to what we see in the Jamesway, set up a little bit differently. And so the period of time they're at each stage, at each temperature, but they do the same thing because that's just a uniform factor of knowledge, is that we have to control our air temperature to give the embryo what they need. So they do the same thing. As you get out here towards 18 days, their temperatures have continued to drop as well. And then you can see their other setups they have here. So kind of the uniform of how we manage it. So our profiles during our endothermic stage, and this is an example of Jamesway again, 0 to 7 days, we are looking at maintaining that shell temperature. So we have a little bit higher air temperature to maintain the 100.2 shell temperature. A lot of this was done with our pilot eggs, so we're able to monitor this during the incubation process and see how the machine worked to give us those results. And then that neutral phase, same thing here, is that our air temperature starts to have to drop to maintain that shell temperature. And that is so important to give us that proper broiler. Again, if we start getting them too hot at this stage here, we stall development, we stress the embryo, and we can have some long-term effects. We saw some birds just a couple of weeks ago that had heat stressed very early on in that first week, and we had some very negative effects on quality of the birds. Some of the most extreme examples I'd seen, and they knew that had happened. So happens early on. You can incubate right after that, but it's an effect that's just going to linger with you because you can't change again what's supposed to happen at certain times. in incubation. So the exothermic stage, again, maintaining the pilot egg, trying to maintain that shell temperature, and to do so, that air temperature just continually had to drop to keep that shell temperature. So again, using some of the technology we have, we're able to kind of learn how the machine needs to respond to get the results we want. So we can look at throughout the period of time to maintain a shell temperature. What is our machine having to do with our air temperature? And again, he's just using that pilot where it's responding to that shell temperature and having to drop that air temperature to give us the real results we're looking for. So as the embryos transition from endothermic, neutral to exothermic, we maintain basically a same shell temperature, but our air temperature is having to change pretty dramatically. So the key controlling that embryonic heat in the single stage incubators, even our multi-stage, we have to control this, but in our single stage, we can do it a little bit better, is the profile or the stage program as we would see in Chickmaster. We all follow the same principles. Going through 3 stages of development is how we then we set our temperatures to give us those results. What do we do for strains that maybe produce less metabolic heat? For low fertile flocks, whatever, we may add more heat. We might add a 1/10 here on a layer strain or something to kind of get them started a little bit better. So we add heat at this point. Those that are producing a lot of metabolic heat back here, we may end up cooling them down more, as we see from our pilot results, what the machine had to do. A lot of metabolic heat, they're having to cool that air temperature more and more to maintain that shell temperature. So that's how we manage that. Now, if we've got multi-stage, whether it be Chickmaster or Jamesway or any other, really the machines, the way they're set up and the eggs are set in the machines, we're attempting to do the same thing, just not as precisely as we can in some of our single stage. Kind of summarizing this, how the machines work, and then I'll kind of wrap up on kind of the final results on that, is looking at our air temperature required to maintain that shell temperature, balanced with the embryonic heat production. So heat production goes up, air temperature goes down, shell temperatures, we try to maintain that the same. And again, these are examples. These numbers may be different in different situations, but that's how we balance it. So in avian development begins, of course, like I said, initially begins with the initial proliferation of cells and the tissues that make up the embryo. It starts at fertilization. And actually, the results of our performance of our birds actually starts before the eggs get in the incubator and our storage, as I talked about, because we can then damage that embryo. We can stress it out and get a lot of embryo loss due to improper egg storage conditions or time. The newly hatched chicks that hatches out, escapes the shell, then begins a path that it, to perform whatever function it is, whether it be a meat bird or a layer or whatever. But the thing I want to really emphasize here is stress anywhere in this process will hurt the final product, the chick and its performance, anywhere. So, when I was teaching at the university, one of the things we talked about is like, you can ask new students, is how long does it grow out? We'll use broilers as an example. How long does a broiler grow out? Well, 6 or 7 weeks. Like, no, it's 9 to 10 weeks, because we got 3 weeks in that egg. And as we shorten their grow out, the time required to get the birds to market age, the incubation time has remained the same. So there's actually a higher percentage of time in that period from fertilization to hit the market in the incubator as there is out in the field now. Stress anywhere in that process will hurt the final performance. I'm sure y'all can support that. You look at your data, you get poor hatching flocks. As a general rule, they're not your best performing chicks out in the field. You get your best hatching flocks, they're generally your better performing birds out in the field, because those are poor hatching, stress somewhere in the process, damage the embryos. We lost some embryos during the incubation process and maybe even at hatch. Those that still hatch were also stressed. And that's one thing we have to remember, is that, if we got poor hatch, we're going to have some poorer performance. As a general rule, we have magic growers that can do magic things, but for the most part, that pretty much holds true. The goal of managing and better understanding of the embryo heat is the chick quality. What is our chick quality? Part of chick quality is how it performs after it leaves the hatchery. Now, we can kind of go back and forth with that, is how much of 7-day and 14-day livability is related to the hatchery. There's definitely some ties to it, as we discussed. Now, you can definitely, ruin that with poor performance out in the field, or poor management out in the field, even if you had prime quality chicks. But you've got to have the best quality chicks to get that best performance. And that comes from managing that embryonic heat, and not just getting chicks, but getting the quality chicks we want. The results are improved bird performance. We see it. We've got a lot of data where we've shown when we started transitioning from multi-stage and single stage, and the comparison of them is the effects it might have on hatchability, but also on bird performance, because we can give that embryo precisely what it needs, when it needs it during embryo development. We can make sure they're not stressed. We can make sure they're not chilled. We can adjust our environment in our cabinet such that that embryo gets what it needs, when it needs, and gives us that best chick. So the grow out process begins at fertilization, not at chick placement. It's a big continuous program, and the performance of the birds is certainly affected by our hatchery and the chick quality. So with that, I will finish up. If you have any questions, you can always send questions to webinars@jamesway.com, or you can email myself at Jamesway as well. You can see my address here. So with that, we'll turn it back over to David and let him take it from here, see where we go.
Thank you, Dr. Bramwell. As always, a great program talking about things that are important to those of us that have spent time in hatcheries. Let's go straight to the questions. We've got several out here that are of interest.
Is my screen, my presentation's off there, correct?
Yes, yeah, you're good.
Okay.
During a consult, how can I check if the ventilation in the setter is okay?
Well, one obviously we can go in and like in a multi-stage, we can do our crossbar temperatures and our infertile egg temperatures and things like that. We can do that. But the other thing is really we can't get hung up on that number. We're really trying to look at not only just chick quality, hatchability, chick quality, but for me, I think a big thing is when we do our breakouts, and we'll use a multi-stage, but this will work with single stage, and we do a top, middle, and bottom. And I've seen this in some hatcheries where it's like we do that to get a uniform representation of our hatch residue breakout. Well, I've seen this in some cases where we've seen, why is it that out of 8 flocks, the middle of those racks were always had higher embryo mortality? Right. One thing that tells me right away, there's a ventilation issue, because we should have very similar top, middle to bottom. And so we can do that in our single stage too. And if people are concerned with that, and so we're not sure we're getting good uniformity, we're getting some baskets that have high embryo loss and some that are not, make sure we make record of the position in those machines, in a single stage, where those all up against the wall. Right. Some of those, the trolleys at the bottom, right next to the ECU or the fan. So that's the thing, is really looking at our chicks and learning the position in the machines, because it'll tell you if you've got some.
And everything you analyze needs to be accurate. No reason to chase a rabbit on this situation.
Right. And I'm a big proponent of not just, well, our numbers say everything's good. It's like, great, but do your chicks say everything's good? Do your performance say everything's good? Because, a number is a production of a machine, a piece of equipment. That's not what we're chasing. We're chasing good chicks and good quality. Absolutely. That's our real final answer.
How do you establish temperature profiles by line, particularly for single stage incubators?
For Jamesway anyway, we had the pilot egg, and that's really helped us. That's where we learned a lot of this information. For instance, we put the pilot egg in machines full of one strain or another, and then learned, okay, so what the pilot does then is it's measuring the shell temperature of 4 eggs around it. And so we've got numerous eggs in there, or devices in there that'll measure 4 eggs each. So they're measuring that shell temperature. So if we have a strain that either produces less heat, or smaller eggs or bigger eggs, and the heat has changed one way or another, then it'll adjust that air temperature in there to maintain that shell. So that's how we learned that. And then now we go based on that. We have customers that say, well, we tried a cooler profile and we're still not seeing some results. We might even go a little bit cooler, adjust that. But we did learn that initially through that pilot egg, because that reads I call that the mother hen of our machines.
Absolutely.
It's like that hen sitting there saying, these eggs are too warm, I need to get up more. That pilot egg sitting there said, this shell temperature is a little bit too warm, we need to cool more.
And with those pilot eggs, we're doing top, middle, and bottom again, wanting
Yep.
to understand completely what's happening in that incubation
Absolutely.
unit. Is it recommended to pre-warm eggs in the setter room hallway prior to setting in a multi-stage incubator to avoid sweating and maintain better machine temperatures?
Well, I've had this discussion many years ago before I was with Jamesway, and I know some people, you know, they don't like the pre-warming of eggs. I think pre-warming is always a good thing if it's done right. And the example I'll use is we had somebody I worked with many years ago that was doing just as you were saying, is they were putting the buggies in the hallway to pre-warm, to get them out of that cooler. Let's get them pre-warmed before we put them in the machine so we don't have as cold of eggs going in that multi-stage and let it recover quicker. The problem was is their hallway didn't have very good air ventilation and air movement, and they pushed all the buggies right up next to each other. So they left them in there about 8 hours, and they said, we're still not seeing effects. So then they went out to 12 hours, and actually their hatch window got worse. Well, they didn't realize is that they put all these buggies right next to each other with no air movement. The middle never did pre-warm, the outside pre-warm. Right. So that's my concern with just sticking them in a hallway. If you don't have good air movement through there, you could create a bigger or worse problem. So yeah, pre-warming is a good thing if you can get them spaced out and good air movement through there, but that is really a key factor, is getting them all pre-warmed properly.
You also have to think about biosecurity where you're pre-warming. Wherever that sweating starts, what are you bringing into the egg?
Right, right. Like a lot of things, pre-warming is a good thing if done right. We can say that about a whole lot of things in this industry. Well,
sure,
that's a good thing
absolutely.
If you do it right. If you don't, it's bad.
Will moisture loss or yield measure the same incubation environment? That is, can yield be okay, but incubation temperature is not optimal for particular lines?
Again, the final result of what we're looking at is the chick and the yield and the performance. Now, when we go back to moisture loss, let me make a comment on that moisture loss, because we get this a little bit, this moisture loss, because Jamesway anyway recommends a different moisture loss for our single stage and multi-stage. And a lot of people don't understand why in our single stage, we're looking at 9 to 10%, and our multi-stage, maybe 11.5 to 12 or so, maybe 12.5, but around that 12. Well, essentially you've got a range of what, so if you have some at 12, you have some at 10 and 14, and the 14 or 15, well, the higher ones obviously is not good, but if we tried in a multi-stage to go 9%, we're going to have some at 6 or 7, which that's not good. Our single stage can keep that range tighter. So that's why we say we prefer a moisture loss of 9 to 10 in the single stage, because it's more uniform than a multi-stage. So then we look at our performance. That's just one of the things. We want that moisture loss right. Then we look at chick quality, or navels, are they healed, are the chicks dried, or they're ready to hatch out and perform. So really it's bird performance on it, but there is a difference in those two that we look for. But again, that's a tool, but I always caution people to not say, we want this moisture loss, my gosh, everything else be damned, that's what we're going to get. No, we need to use that as a tool to get our bird quality.
And Keith, speak very quickly, I know we're running out of time. Talk about the electrotherms that are in use and the accuracy of the proper probe, and how critical it is to go into our machines and to calibrate, because whatever we measure, we're going to make adjustment for, but we better be looking at accuracy before we make adjustments.
I appreciate you saying the short answer, because I tend to not do that very much. Calibration is like, if any of you know Henry Cole, he is a calibrate. That is critical to calibrate our probes and make sure they are giving us the proper readings, because if it's telling us one reading and the machine's operating based on that, we're not going to get the results. And if he was on here, he would get on a soapbox and go off. But calibration just cannot be ignored. We've got to keep everything calibrated. So when we looked at our probes and our electrotherms, keep in mind that the calibration of them and making sure they're accurate is of utmost importance.
Well, let me remind all participants, any questions that we don't have time to answer, we will answer via email. And if you signed up and registered for this webinar program, you will be receiving a link so that you can join us and get the information you're looking for from this presentation. Dr. Bramwell, you did a great job. It is critical. Obviously, we have seen our industry go from mercury stats and electrotherms to digital controllers and now to new single stage technology. So it seems like as an industry, we're doing everything to try to replicate what the hen did, but maybe even do it a little better.
And I think, yeah, I think, you know, as things change, as the heat production, metabolism, the birds we're selecting, particularly on the broiler side, a faster growing bird with a higher metabolism and producing more heat. But I think one of the things that I've seen in my years is probably more of a tie to the effects of what our incubation have on our bird. And it's not just, we're not just producing a chick, we've got to produce a quality chick. Right. And now that I think we're understanding this more, of giving the embryo exactly what it needs,
yeah,
it can pay off hugely when we're looking at bird performance, because it's not just, hey, get a chick and give it to the farm and let them do with it. It's not the way it is anymore. And I think we understand that better than we used to, which means that we need to get after this in our incubation and making sure we are doing what we know we can do to give us that performance.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank all of our participants for your time today. I'm David Hammond. I'm with Dr. Keith Bramwell. We were Jamesway Chickmaster Incubators. We're glad to be with you and help you down the road with the challenges you face in the incubators today. Please join us on LinkedIn and be a part of our organization moving forward to provide better quality service and products to the industry. Thank you, Dr. Bramwell.
Thank you.